The wind in that valley was a collector of secrets, each grain of dust it lifted a tiny witness to a grand cruelty. It carried whispers of scorn from the clapboard storefronts to the sun-scorched stoops, weaving a narrative of humiliation that was meant to be Ilara's undoing. She stood beside her meager belongings, a single leather-bound trunk that held all she had in the world, and felt the town's collective gaze as a physical weight. They had told her he was a landowner, a man of substance. A fresh start. It was a lie spun from the arrogant silk of Jedediah's malice, the wealthy rancher's son who saw people as pawns in his cruel games. The man they brought forth was Elias, and the town's sneer was a venomous thing. He was a mountain of a man, broad in the shoulder and thick in the middle, with hands that seemed carved from granite. Beside him, clinging to his leg as if it were the only stable thing on earth, was a small boy, his son, Leo. The boy was a ghost, all wide, terrified eyes and a silence so profound it seemed to suck the air from around him. Jedediah and his cohort watched from the saloon porch, their laughter a brittle crackle in the tense air. This was the joke. The proud, destitute beauty paired with the town's hulking, silent outcast. But as Ilara looked at Elias, she saw past the form they mocked. She saw the deep, abiding shame in his downcast eyes, not for himself, but for the indignity she was being forced to endure. And in the boy's terrified grip, she saw a pain that mirrored her own isolation. In that moment, something shifted within her. They had intended to break her spirit. Instead, they had given it a direction. She lifted her chin, the gesture small but seismic, and gave Elias a nod that was clear and deliberate. It was an acceptance. Not of their joke, but of the man and the child who were its unwilling participants. The journey to his property was a silent one, the wagon wheels grinding a mournful rhythm on the rutted track. The land grew wilder, the neat fences of the town giving way to untamed scrub and skeletal trees. The house, when they reached it, was a portrait of neglect. It was a sturdy structure of stone and timber, built to withstand generations, but it sagged with a palpable sadness, as if mourning a life that had been lost within its walls. Shutters hung crooked, the porch steps groaned in protest, and the yard was a riot of defiant weeds. This was not a home, it was a shell. Leo, who had not let go of his father's side for the entire journey, finally released his grip and scurried into the shadows of the dark interior like a startled field mouse. Elias stood motionless on the porch, his immense frame silhouetted against the dying light. He did not speak. His silence was not one of anger or indifference, it was the heavy, compacted silence of grief. He seemed to be waiting for her to turn, to flee back toward the mocking town. Ilara looked from the decaying house to the man's broad back, a landscape of quiet sorrow. She could feel the weight of his unspoken apology, the shame of his meager offering. She walked past him, her boots making a soft, determined sound on the dusty planks. She set down her trunk, unlatched it, and took out a simple broom. With slow, deliberate strokes, she began to sweep the dust and grime from the porch. It was a small act, almost insignificant, but it was an answer. It was a declaration. She was not leaving. She was staying. She was beginning. Elias watched the steady motion of her arms, the quiet purpose in her posture, and for the first time, the granite lines of his face seemed to soften, if only for a moment. Days bled into a silent routine. Elias would leave at dawn, his tools clinking softly, to work stones at a distant quarry, his labor the only currency the town afforded him. Ilara learned the geography of the quiet house, the way the light fell through the grimy panes of glass, the floorboards that cried out underfoot. The most silent part of the house was Leo. He was a whisper of a child, moving along the edges of rooms, his presence felt more than seen. He ate little, never spoke, and his eyes held a permanent state of alarm. One afternoon, while airing out the contents of a dusty wardrobe, Ilara found it, a small, hand-stitched quilt, its colors faded, a corner ripped and frayed. It was clear from the careful, loving stitches that it had been a cherished object. She sensed it had belonged to his mother. She took the quilt to her own sewing kit, her needles and thread, some of the few fine things she possessed. For hours she worked, not merely patching the tier, but reweaving the pattern, her stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was not just mending fabric, she was honoring a memory, tending to a wound she could not see. When she was finished, she folded it neatly and left it on the small, crude chair beside Leo's bed. She said nothing. The next morning, it was gone. Later, she saw him from the kitchen window, huddled near the crooked fence line, the mended quilt wrapped tightly around his small shoulders. He was holding the corner she had repaired, his thumb stroking the seamless new stitches. It was their first conversation, a silent communion of care given and care received. From the edge of the property, Elias stood watching, his work-worn hands resting on a fence post. He saw the quilt around his son, and a profound, unreadable emotion crossed his face. He looked at Ilara, a silent acknowledgement that she was mending more than just cloth. The land around the house was as wounded as its inhabitants. A patch of earth that might have once been a garden was now a graveyard of stones and thistles. Ilara decided it would live again. It was backbreaking work. The soil was stubborn, packed hard by years of neglect and summer heat. She had only a rusty spade and her own determination. She worked until her hands were raw and her back screamed in protest. She was turning the soil, but she was also turning her despair into purpose. Each stone she pulled from the earth was a resentment cast aside, each weed, a piece of bitterness uprooted. The townspeople, on their rare trips down the old track, would slow their wagons, watching her toil with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw a fool's errand, a desperate woman trying to cultivate dust. Elias would watch her from a distance when he returned in the evenings, his face impassive. Then, one evening, he came not to the house, but to the edge of her nascent garden. He said nothing. He simply began to clear a space nearby, his large hands working with an astonishing deftness. He selected stones from the piles she had discarded, turning them over, judging their weight and shape. The next day, he began to build a low wall, a foundation. He laid the stones without mortar, fitting them together in a seamless, solid puzzle. He was a master of his craft. He was not just clearing stones, he was giving her garden a boundary, a defense. He was giving it form. It was a partnership forged in silence, a shared language of creation spoken through stone and soil. He built the foundation, and she planted the seeds of life within it. Their quiet progress did not go unnoticed. It was an affront to the narrative Jedediah had authored. His joke was supposed to end in misery and destitution, not in neatly laid stone walls and the promise of a garden. His arrogance demanded an audience and a victim. One afternoon, he rode out to the property, 2 of his lackeys in tow. They reined in their horses, trampling the very edge of Ilara's tilled soil. "Well, well," Jedediah drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Playing house in the dirt." How quaint. Ilara stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a calm mask. Elias moved to stand slightly in front of her, his presence a silent shield. Jedediah's eyes narrowed, fixing on Elias. "Still can't afford to feed yourself, you fat ox," he sneered. "Got her doing the work of a plough horse for you." Elias's jaw was a line of solid rock. He did not speak, did not move. He simply absorbed the insults, his stillness more powerful than any retort. This infuriated Jedediah more than any outburst would have. With a sudden, vicious kick, he sent a stack of carefully selected stones scattering. They were the stones Elias had set aside for the next section of the wall. They clattered uselessly into the dust. "A pigsty is all this will ever be," Jedediah spat, before wheeling his horse around and galloping away, his friend's laughter trailing behind him like poison. Elias stared at the scattered stones, and for the first time, Ilara saw a tremor in his large, steady hands. From the doorway of the house, a small face watched, and Leo, at the sound of the crash and the cruel laughter, vanished back into the safety of the shadows. The threat was no longer a distant whisper, it had arrived at their door. That night, the sky broke. A furious storm descended upon the valley, the wind howling like a hungry wolf and the rain coming down in blinding sheets. Thunder rattled the very bones of the little stone house. In the main room, lit only by a single flickering lantern, Ilara found Leo. He was huddled in the farthest corner, his small body rigid with terror, the mended quilt clutched to his chest. He was trembling uncontrollably, his eyes wide and fixed on the window where lightning bleached the world white for a split second. Ilara felt a surge of empathy for the boy, a recognition of a fear so deep it stole the breath. She didn't rush to him or offer empty platitudes. Instead, she pulled a small wooden stool near his corner, just outside the circle of his fear, and sat down. She began to hum. It was a simple, wordless tune, a low and steady melody that wove itself into the chaos of the storm, not fighting it, but providing a small, human anchor within it. A few minutes later, a large shadow fell across the room. Elias stood in the doorway to his own room, his massive frame filling the space. He didn't enter, didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent, powerful sentinel guarding the entrance. He was watching his son, but he was also listening to her song. The storm raged on, but inside the house, something shifted. Caught between the terrifying, impersonal violence of the storm outside and the quiet, steadfast presence of the two adults inside, Leo made a choice. Slowly, hesitantly, he uncurled himself. He crawled across the floor, dragging his quilt with him, and came to a stop at his father's feet. He leaned his small head against the solid strength of Elias's leg. It was the first time Ilara had seen him initiate contact, the first time he had sought comfort from his father. Elias looked down, and in the lantern light, Ilara saw his throat work as he swallowed. He slowly, so slowly, lowered his hand and let it rest on his son's head. A family. In the heart of the storm, they were becoming a family. The storm passed, and in its wake, the world felt cleansed and new. The air was crisp, the dust was settled, and the thirsty earth drank deeply. The work on their small homestead continued with a renewed sense of purpose. The garden, nourished by the rain, began to show the first tender green shoots of life. It was a miracle of green against the brown earth. And the wall grew. Under Elias's masterful hands, it became more than just a border. It became a thing of beauty. He worked with the stones as if he knew their secret names, fitting them together with an artist's eye. The wall curved gracefully around the garden, its surface a tapestry of texture and color, solid and elegant. It was a testament to his skill, a quiet rebuttal to the town's judgment. It was a symbol of their shared creation, a physical manifestation of the sanctuary they were building for themselves. The townspeople began to see. On their journeys past, they no longer saw a fool's errand. They saw a thriving garden protected by a wall worthy of a master stonemason. They saw the green shoots and the solid stone, and the woman and the man who worked in tandem without needing words. The whispers in the town began to change their tune. Scorn turned to a grudging curiosity, which slowly bloomed into a quiet respect. They had witnessed Elias's strength for years, but they had mistaken his silence for simplicity. Now they saw it as patience. They had witnessed Ilara's resilience, mistaking it for desperation. Now they saw it as dignity. They were watching something being built from nothing, and it challenged the very foundation of their prejudice. The joke had failed. In its place, something real and formidable was growing. Jedediah saw it too. He saw the wall, the garden, the transformation of the neglected plot into a place of life and order. He saw the way Ilara no longer looked like a victim, but a creator. He saw the way Elias stood taller, his work a source of visible, quiet pride. Most of all, he saw the town's changing opinion. He heard the whispers of respect, and they felt like personal insults. His power was built on the perception of others, on his ability to elevate himself by diminishing those around him. Their dignity was a direct threat to his arrogance. He could not tolerate it. The family's quiet success became a mirror that reflected his own ugliness, and he was determined to shatter it. He saw the stone wall not as a beautiful creation, but as a monument to his failed cruelty. It had to come down. His envy curdled into a cold, calculated rage. This was no longer a joke, it had become a contest of wills, a battle between creation and destruction. He gathered his sycophants, his words twisting the family's hard-won progress into an act of defiance against the town's established order. He painted their quiet life as an insult, their happiness as an unearned prize. He would not just undo their work, he would do it publicly, reasserting his dominance and reminding everyone of the power he believed he wielded. The air in the valley grew heavy again, charged with the malice of his intent. A final, violent confrontation was inevitable. It happened on a Sunday, a day when the valley was still and the townspeople were gathered outside the church, lingering in the morning sun. Jedediah chose his moment for maximum impact. He and his two cronies came riding hard down the track, not with laughter this time, but with a grim, destructive purpose. They carried heavy iron pry bars. They stopped before the stone wall, the symbol of everything they had come to hate. From the churchyard, the townsfolk watched, a silent, nervous gallery. Ilara and Elias, who had been tending to the rows of new seedlings, stood up. Leo, who had been tracing patterns in the dirt nearby, froze. Jedediah dismounted, a cruel smirk on his face. "Time to clear this rubble," he announced to the silent audience, his voice loud and arrogant. He jammed the pry bar into a crevice in Elias's beautiful wall and heaved. A single stone dislodged and fell to the ground with a sickening thud. Elias finally moved. He stepped forward, placing himself between Jedediah and the wall. He was not angry. He was immense, immovable, a force of nature woken from a long slumber. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the unnatural silence with the weight of stone itself. No, Jedediah, incensed by the simple defiance, shoved Elias in the chest. It was like shoving a mountain. Elias didn't even rock on his feet. He just stood there, a guardian of his home, his family, his creation. But before Jedediah could strike again, another voice cut through the air. "That's enough, Jedediah." It was the town blacksmith, a man as sturdy as his own anvil, stepping out from the crowd. Then another man joined him, and another. The townspeople, who had once been a chorus of scorn, began to move. They walked down the track and formed a human chain, standing between Jedediah and the family. They stood with Elias. Humiliated, his power revealed as nothing more than bluster, Jedediah dropped his pry bar. He was defeated not by force, but by a community's change of heart. As he mounted his horse to slink away in disgrace, a small, clear voice rose from beside Elias. "Pa," it was Leo. He was looking up at his father, his face full of awe and pride. In the quiet aftermath, the air hummed with a new harmony. The townspeople did not disperse. Instead, the blacksmith picked up the fallen stone, his hands assessing its weight, and carried it back to the wall. He looked at Elias, a question in his eyes. Elias gave a slow, grateful nod. Soon, others were helping, retrieving the scattered tools and offering quiet words of support, their gestures a form of apology for their past judgment. The wall was repaired in minutes, the communal effort sealing the rift not just in the stone, but in the heart of the valley itself. The seasons that followed saw the garden flourish, its bounty shared freely with the neighbors who now stopped not to gawk, but to talk. The stone house, once a symbol of sorrow, became a true home, filled with the low murmur of conversation and, occasionally, the bright, startling sound of a child's laughter. Ilara, Elias, and Leo had been brought together by a cruel joke, three broken pieces of a life they thought was over. But with quiet dignity, unwavering kindness, and the strength to create in the face of destruction, they had built a foundation stronger than any stone. They had found their world not in the land they owned or the house they lived in, but in each other. They had become a family, whole and healed, under the wide, approving sky. The world will often try to tell you who you are, to write your story with its own cruel ink. It will judge you by your appearance, by your silence, by your perceived weaknesses. But your worth is not determined by the opinions of others, it is forged in the quiet moments of your own integrity. It is built by what you choose to create when others choose to destroy. It is measured by the kindness you show when you are shown none. If this story of resilience and love reminded you that the strongest foundations are built with dignity and compassion, then help us share it. Like this video, subscribe for more stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit, and share in the comments how you have seen kindness triumph over cruelty in your own life. Your story matters. Let's build a community that proves it.